Dear friends, welcome to the 14th lecture of the Aligarh Society of History and Archaeology, ASHA, and Ganga Jamuni joint venture to present a scientific and secular past. Today's lecture is part of the series Reflections of Our Shared Past. It would revolve around a very important topic, our shared linguistic history. The topic, as announced, is Before the Hindi-Urdu Divide. Day before yesterday, Professor Najaf Haider spoke about a text written in a language defined by many as Braj Bhasha, also entitled or identified as Hindavi. Najaf also opined that though Khusro is one of the first to talk of Hindavi, but he seldom wrote in it, though many Hindavi verses of Khusro are floating all around us. Dr. Sunil Sharma too doubts the veracity of these verses being attributed to Amir Khusro. Today, the well-known scholar of Hindi, Dr. Francesca Orsini, would further open up the layers for us. Dr. Orsini is Professor of Hindi and South Asian Literature at SOAS, University of London, a Fellow of the British Academy, and the author of the Hindi Public Sphere 1920-1940, Language and Literature in the Age of Nationalism, published in 2002. Another book of hers is Print and Pleasure, Popular Literature and Entertaining Fictions in Colonial North India, published in 2009. She has just finished a book on the multilingual literary history of Awadh, North India, from the 15th century to the early 20th century, and is leading an Horizon 2020 ERC research project on multilingual locals and significant geographies for a new approach to world literature from the perspective of three regions: North India, the Maghreb, and the Horn of Africa. Her authorship is not confined to these books only. One of her books is in Hindi, Hindi Ka Lokvrit, published in 2011. Two of her most popular and well-accepted edited works are Before the Divide, Hindi and Urdu Literary Culture, published in 2011, based on a workshop on intermediary genres in Hindi and Urdu. And the second one is Tellings and Texts, Music, Literature and Performance in North India, which she did with Catherine Schofield in 2015. Dr. Orsini also edits the journal Love in South Asia. I was fortunate enough to have been at SOAS in May 2007 when she organized a grand seminar after Temur left, which ultimately formed the basis of her 2014 publication, along with Samira Sheikh, who is also scheduled to deliver a lecture to us later on. After Temur left, Culture and Circulation in 15th century North India is the result of this particular seminar. This seminar was a very well-attended one in which scholars like late Simon Digby and late Alison Bush, amongst a host of others, had taken part. I was also fortunate to be a part of the weekly seminars which Dr. Orsini used to organize those days. In fact, I too got a chance to speak in one of them. Dr. Francesca Orsini is a constant visitor to India. She visited us at Aligarh way back, I don't remember whether it was 2008 or 9, and also delivered a lecture at the Department of History, which was chaired by Professor Irfan Habib. Today, she will be speaking to us on the topic Before the Hindi-Urdu Divide. Over to you, Dr. Orsini. Dr. Francesca Orsini, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Rezavi, and thank you to Shagufta for organizing this. I will now share my screen and start. Right, so in fact, I have been to Aligarh and to the library several times. I think last time, I don't think 2014 for sure, but even afterwards, to your wonderful, wonderful library, the Center for Persian Studies. You know, it's one of my favorite places. Today, I'm going to come back to the topic of the Hindi-Urdu divide from two perspectives. One is the kind of general way, public discourse around language, how we talk about languages and languages' identities, and the other is from my own disciplinary field, which is literary history. I'm always struck how when we talk about languages or language identities, we're immediately placed into language camps. You are, which are exclusionary. So you can either be a Hindi wali, or an Angrezi wali, or an Urdu wali. I remember watching this debate years ago, or when the question of the compulsory English exam for UPSC exams was raised. On We the People, and willy-nilly the host Barkadat immediately placed whatever people were actually saying. I remember Professor Alok Rai, Ashok Vajpayee were actually making points that were across languages, but they were immediately placed into the Hindi camp. And despite the fact, in fact, that most, if not all of us, have more than one language as part of our makeup. So of course, being put into language camps is in fact a result of what I'm going to talk about today, this sort of Hindi-Urdu divide. It has to do with a sort of community identity around language, with nationalism, but how accurate historically and how beneficial it is when the reality and the individual and social level is much more complicated than that. So, I think just very briefly to go back to the history of this divide. Of course, there are many really important works that have shown how the divide sort of grew, sort of started and grew in the 19th century, as Christopher King put it, in one language and two scripts, starting from the kind of colonial state decision to to be inconsistent in matters of education and administrative and sort of legal policy, so that colonial education, limited though it was in the northwestern provinces, both in Hindi and Urdu, but the administration and the law courts, when Farsi was replaced by the regional vernaculars or regional languages, was in Urdu only. Of course, the aftermath of 1857 and the kind of whole change in the sort of the balance of authority and power, of course, didn't lead to the demise of Urdu at all. 19th century is very much a century in which Urdu is very strong. But what you have is in the 1860s, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, and further, this sort of consolidation of and mobilization of the Hindu public around the issue of Hindi, the recognition first of Nagari as a script for in the law courts and in the administration as a language of Nokri, with the kind of symbolic victory of 1900. A mobilization that also got entangled with sort of a new discourse about history and sort of ancient, medieval, and modern history, with very much what I call the kind of when Muslim came to explain all kinds of social and ills and sort of cultural decline, with issues of car protection and so on. And what we see is kind of really a crystallization under a kind of new discourse of language, a new discourse of language that comes, yes, from Europe, from Enlightenment and Romanticism in Europe, but that very much is taken on very sort of vigorously by Hindi activists and political activists too, with the idea that you have a mother tongue and you should be true to your mother tongue. If you're educated or you write or read in another language than your mother tongue, you're a traitor to it. So if you're a Hindu who is educated in Urdu or Farsi, you were a traitor and you were not doing seva to your mother tongue. Of course, the idea that Hindi, as the daughter of Sanskrit, was the authentically Indian language, whereas Urdu, as possibly the daughter of Persian, or would not be authentically Indian. Urdu, the whole long-standing debate that has been debunked by Dr. Shamsur Farooqi most beautifully, but keeps coming up of Urdu as the language, mistakenly understood as the language of the horde, and so associated with the invasion and so on. Debate that was also, conducted on ostensibly neutral scientific terms of, what was the most scientific or easy or practical script, because these were debates that had to do with identity, but also with practical methods of education. And what we find what we have still now, a kind of a crystallization, an association, a clustering of script, language, and community. So that, Hindi has to be written in Nagari. Hindi is that which is written in Nagari script and is the language of the Hindu community. Urdu has to be written in the Persian Urdu script and is the language of ? Very much part of this sort of mobilization that led both to a discursive divide, but also very much a kind of a divide in terms of histories, in terms of literary histories, in terms of archiving and scholarship, were literary associations. First of all, the Nagari Prachani Sabha of Banaras, established in 1893. And what this produced were kind of competing geographies. So here we have two examples where sort of proponents and scholars or activists of Hindi and Urdu sort of try to say that, no, Urdu came first, no, Hindi came first, no, Urdu came first, no, Hindi came first. So if Hafiz Mahmud Sherani finds in sort of fragments, what I call traces of Urdu fiqh or dohre, which are actually not in sort of Khari Boli Urdu, what we understand now, but in some kind of Hindui, he sees them as enough evidence that this was language. Again, you can see the community identification was the language commonly spoken among Muslims in this period. And it was Muslim peoples, communities, aqwam, who created a special language for themselves. The Nagari Prachani Sabha here summarized by Christopher King. So then competitively saying, no, we were there even before. And despite the lack of any evidence, would say that no, Hindi existed before the invasion. So Prithviraj Raso, which later kind of came to be identified more with the 15th century in the kind of redactions that we have, but attributed by Chand Bardai, and the period of Prithviraj, so at the time of the invasion, and the idea that the invasion prevented the further progress of Hindi. And if you go to the kind of very, you could say, very watered down explanations of the 4 periods of Hindi literary history, so the Raso Kali is the Virgata Kali is the first one. Then you've got Bhakti, because as it was explained to me when I was learning Hindi at the Kendriya Hindi Sansthan in Delhi, then Hindus turn inwards with the invasion, and so they turn towards Bhakti, and then under foreign rule, they became enfeebled, and then you have Riti poetry until the modern period. And although this has been, I'm not saying that this is still necessarily the way in which literary history is taught at university level, I think very much at school level, this kind of divisive, competitive language camps and divisive history of language and of literature is still very much with us. And the attempt, in a way, or let's say before the divide, I understand that before the divide, as a title, suggests that before the divide there was one language. And actually this is not what I'm going to argue today, or what I have argued. And in fact, the attempts, you could say, the attempt like that of Hindustani, with the Hindustani Academy, also Gandhi, Premchand, others, to sort of push Hindustani, not in the British colonial sense, but in the sense of the common language, was not really successful in the kind of polarization and the divide of the 1920s and 30s, because Hindustani then was really considered as a kind of minimum common denominator. And this was really not enough to represent, you could say, the broad range, and certainly the cultural, the literary, the poetic, but also range. There wasn't space there for Tulsidas, for Surdas, or for Ghalib. Hindustani was considered to be too much of a kind of practical language. So my point today, and yes, both David Lalivel and David Lunn have written very well about the attempt to put forward Hindustani as the common language and the common ground, the middle ground. But in fact, today instead, what I want to argue is that instead of this language script continuum that separates Hindi and Urdu, but instead of positing one language that then got divided, I think it works much better. It's much more also historically accurate to think of a range of languages and scripts. Languages, scripts, and styles. So a range of high languages that you had to learn. So this was not your matribhasha, unless you were, of course, from a Farsi-speaking family. But these were the languages that probably you would have more investment in. Then we know that in the whole kind of sort of you could say pre-18th century period, you have very generic languages, and in fact it's very confusing from the point of view of today, because in kind of Hindi sources, anything that was vernacular was called just bhasha, language. So there was no distinction made between, say, Awadhi or Bhojpuri, or they would just be bhaka. Only when Brajbhasha becomes a recognized poetic vernacular, as Alison Bush and others have shown, does it then actually get named as a separate language. And we know that in Persian sources, you have Hindi for basically, or Indian for basically either Sanskrit or any form of the vernacular. And it's also called Hindui or Hindavi, so the language of the Hindus. And then, of course, from the sort of late 16th, early 17th century, Brajbhasha becomes a very widespread poetic language. Tulsidas writes in Brajbhasha, although he's not a Braj speaker. And Rekhta, then called Urdu, first in the Deccan and then in North India, also starts to get used as a literary language. So a range of languages, a range of poetic styles rather than one language. And scripts too. So instead of this kind of cluster and sort of necessary relation between language and script that we get in discourse from the 19th century, language discourse from the 19th century onwards, you find that actually the same text can be written and copied in different scripts depending on, who is it for, who is the scribe. So let's take these three examples of Malik Muhammad Jaisi's Padmavat. One is copied in Gorakhpur in Persian script, all illustrated, so all with a certain investment. One, interestingly, is copied in Kaiti. This is a rare and a few folios in the Bharat Kala Bhavan in Banaras, and this other, so probably early 19th century copy in Nagari. So obviously script is not a kind of determinant of what the language, or what this text is supposed to be. This text, well, according, would be called in Hindavi, now we would call it Avadhi, but the script depends on the scribe. So I would say that before the divide, rather than one language, we have to think of languages in terms of education and distinction. So typically you would learn you would learn a language that was not the one spoken by your mother. It's better to think about tastes rather than identity, tastes and practices. And again, and this is a useful phrase that Ramya Srinivasan has suggested to me, to think about instead of language communities, which again has this sense of, already, you're born with a language and this is it, and that's the community to which you belong. Instead, communities of taste. So what you like, what you affiliate yourself to, which actually is more similar to Michael Werner's idea of a public. So a public is created by an utterance, by a text. It assembles a public, one or more publics, in fact, you could say. And for that reason, and I tend to prefer to think, rather than one language, take this sort of range, linguistic range, and think of a multilingual perspective. We tend to do literary history, historians tend to do literary histories starting from one language. And that actually, for me, is already kind of problematic within a society in which spaces were multilingual, in which people and their bodies were multilingual. And text, so if I think of spaces and bodies as multilingual, then I think of text as kind of happening somewhere in the middle. And one of the very, very sort of persistent questions that I've had throughout my research on trying to do a multilingual literary history of Purab or Avad has been, well, if everybody was, or many people were so multilingual, if the spaces were so multilingual, why aren't there more multilingual texts? And we can talk about it later, about this, which is an interesting question. This is, of course, not to say that there aren't multilingual texts, but what you more often find are kind of traces, what I call traces. And here are three interesting examples. And why I find them interesting is because, in a way, whenever I talk about multilingualism, people never have a problem. It's, of course, in fact, it sort of leads to generalization. Everybody is multilingual. Multilingualism has always been there. But actually, I think that when you start looking at texts, it's rather than a general point, you're forced to ask particular questions about the people behind them, the communities of taste behind them, the practices behind them. So the one on your left is a folio from a manuscript, in fact, at Aligarh of the Haqaiq-e-Hindi by Mir Abdullah Wahil Bigrami. It was republished recently by the Center of Persian Studies. This is a Sufi risala in Farsi about, what do you do if as a Sufi, seeker, you listen to songs in Hindavi, so in Bhaka, in Hindi, probably more like Braj Bhasha from the little fragments that we can hear, we can detect. Either songs that have to do with Sarapa or Nakshik, or with the seasons and other songs, or with Krishna. And it's very interesting because it's obvious that Mir Abdul Wahid is very familiar with the Krishna theology, but he's not really interested in that. In fact, he gives a completely alternative Sufi interpretation of these terms. Now, why? So what you see in red are the Hindi, I'll just say Hindi just as a sort of shorthand, Hindi or Hindavi maybe, phrases or verses or words. So, I can't remember, it's too small here now, but, there's a whole chapter on, Jashoda and Kanha, and then the monk and the Naina and so on. Now, what is interesting here for me is that this is a trace of a larger practice. So the text itself is not really multilingual. It doesn't give the whole text of the song. So we don't really know what songs they're listening to. But we know that behind this text, there is a practice, a regular practice of listening to Vishnupad, as he says, and Dhrupad. The larger manuscript section at the bottom is, in fact, an early manuscript of Jayas's Padmavat held at the Rampur Raza Library. And what you find is really interesting is that, it's Hindavi or Awadhi, as we would call it now, but you can see that it's all vocalized with the short vowels to give a precise reading of the text. And again, so rather than just saying, oh, it's multilingual, this forces us to ask, okay, is this meant for somebody who really wants to copy it very, very carefully? So is it an effect of a kind of editorial, philological practice, or is it because, in fact, it was copied in Western UP, and this is not really already a language that is very familiar? Interestingly, it also has little glosses, quite generic glosses that either translate. So Kinha is translated as Karda or Karda'u. If you have Meru, it will be translated, glossed as Kuh, and so on. So again, think it's in Hindavi, but meant for a Farsi reader. And the last one I'll come to in a moment. So I think it's really interesting then, that's what I mean, that, texts are in between spaces and people, and you could say communities of taste. And these are traces that make us ask these larger questions. Now, I want to give you two examples of, multilingual, what it was, how, I suppose, how individuals and people were multilingual before the Hindi-Urdu divide. Now, this is an interesting short autobiography of about 20 pages written by a clerk from Chunar. I found it in the UP State Archive Manuscript Library in Alapur in Allahabad. Now, Bhanu Pratap Tiwari in this short autobiography, basically tells us about his education. And his education is basically about learning languages. So, and you can see that, first, his grandfather made him learn Hindi, probably, more like Braj and Sant couplets by heart. He gives a whole list of them as part of another manuscript there. Then he also teaches him Sanskrit. He gets to read the Prem Sagar, Balallu Jilal, so this kind of modern Fort William College Hindi text, but also Tulsidas, so Awadhi. Then he studies Farsi at the Chunar Mission School, the basic, the Bostan, and then goes on with his father and with the Maulvi, reading more sort of Persian classics. At the same time, he also attends a satsang, so he would sing and listen to devotional poetry. The family are in fact devotees, I think, if I remember correctly, either of Paltudas or one of the sort of Avad sons. Then he continues study of Farsi at home, but he also starts studying English at home with Ballantyne's primer, a kind of common primer of the time. For 3 years, he manages to go to an English school, which he loves. He says it's a parikhana, and there's boys and girls there. But then his father gets ill and has to retire from his job, and so he starts working at the Chungi office, I think, in Chunar, but continues self-study of English. So you just wanted to check whether so this is what I mean by, instead of thinking about language as identity, let's think of it in terms of education, of tastes and practices. So what are Bhanu Pratap's literary tastes and practices? Well, he learns, he has his Braj Bhasha Dohe, he knows courtly Hindi. He also has the devotional, more sort of Kabir and other sants type of poetry through the satsang. He has read Persian classics, prose and poetry. He also has a couple of couplets that he quotes in his autobiography. Yes, these are some of the dohe that he remembers his grandfather teaching him. He has some English knowledge. I don't know if he read actually English books. And although he's in fact a contemporary of Bhartendu, I don't really know whether he read much modern Hindi. As you can see here, occasionally, and again, this is a kind of trace of something that you would perhaps expected to find more of, he translates a Farsi couplet into Braj Bhasha. Interestingly, what does he do as a writer? And so he has a translation of the Gulistan in Hindi. But also I found him really, and I was, delighted, of course, when I did, that probably in his work, in his Naukri, he came into contact with William Crook, the editor of North Indian Notes and Queries. And so he was one of those, Maulvis and Munshis who contributed to, this sort of snippets of local songs or poems or curios to North Indian Notes and Queries. Here, he calls it the religious songs of the Dhobis. Pehli naam le Allah Miyan ka, duje Nabi Rasul. A kind of Muslim folklore that in fact is absent otherwise from Hindi folklore collections. So you could say, what is Bhanu Pratap's language? Is it one language? Is it Hindi wala? Or is it in fact this whole range of languages? Let's think of Bhartendu Harishchandra, his contemporary in Benares. Again, clearly from a much higher social class, but, not such different education, in fact. Again, taught at home Hindi, Urdu, Sanskrit. His father was a Braj Bhasha poet, so he becomes a Braj Bhasha poet. He also studies Sanskrit with several pandits, in fact. He has a couple of years at Queen's College in Benares, but in fact doesn't really take to it and leaves it. He also learns Bengali, and he learns music and cultivated intercourse with the wives in Benares. And what is really interesting, though of course Harishchandra is known as the kind of father of modern Hindi, and his famous Nij Bhasha Unnati Hai Sab Unnati Ko Mool, and in fact, although he was quite vocal with, for example, the Hunter Commission for primary education, you could say, if we look at his language ideology, he's very much part, you could say, of the language movement and the divide. So one sort of rehashing one of those Hindi sort of discourse about Urdu being the language of dancing girls and prostitutes. Of course, the dancing girls that he actually went and sort of consorted with. And the whole thing about how it's more difficult pronunciation and unpleasant and unnatural and so on. But then if you look at his literary taste, again, they're very eclectic. They are, you have Brajbhasha poetry, from Samasya Purti to sort of song, Tumri, Chaiti, and so on. His plays are full of Braj and Urdu songs. His essays are very, have a whole range of language registers, some sort of Macaronic Sanskrit, Macaronic Marathi, some sort of English, and he even tried some Urdu verse with the Takhallus Rasa, as Sagri Sengupta has shown. Not nothing very complicated, but again, he was experimenting and he was trying and he was eclectic. And sometimes, we are surprised by his eclecticism, but in fact, I think is a very, very sort of common eclecticism. And a common eclecticism of taste, I would say, that has in fact sort of continued even after the language divide. So the language divide has been very influential at the level of discourse, at the level of ideology, at the level of institutions, of course. But I think at the level of taste, there are still, a lot of, widespread familiarity and intelligibility, as you find in, anything from Parsi theatre and, later cinema. And in fact, it's quite interesting that, barring Persian, you could say, or, Persian and Hindi, otherwise the range of tastes that Bhartendu and Wajid Ali Shah have is not different. Certainly not that different. Now, to come to, sorry, just check, keep an eye on the time. So to come to the volume before the Hindi-Urdu divide, in fact, again, the essays in the book do not really point to, a single language. As Professor Rezavi was saying, we rather thought that, by investigating, not necessarily minor, but, interstitial, so intermediary or interstitial genres between the kind of mainstream genres that we associate Hindi and Urdu with, so ghazal or Brajbhasha poetry, bhakti and riti, we actually find a whole range of other genres that, it's more difficult to say what do they belong to. They really come out of this multilingual range. So Imre Banga, for example, shows that the consciously mixed language is there, not maybe majorly, but it's there from, Sufis, even at the Mughal court, certainly in this sort of interesting, persistent genres of Baramasas with the sants and so on. So Dadu, Nanak, you have sort of this sort of attempt at mixing Farsi and some version of Hindavi Braj in a whole range, a whole range of people. Alison's Bush, the much missed Alison, article was much more about, okay, how do we understand particular choice of register, so sort of Shelley style, choice of words in, say, Rajbhasha courtly poetry. If you have more Persianized words, do we have to think that they necessarily carry a motivation, a meaning, or can they be also just wordplay with sound and so on? Thomas de Bruyne's essay was about how the katha, Sufi prem katha, as I prefer to call the Premakyanda. So the Sufi romance writers like Jayasi, Qutban, and so on, how they consciously played with their, but also their audience's familiarity with the Ramayana or characters from the Puranas or from the epics. Lalita Duperron looked at, again, language mixing or the particular range of registers in Khayal song texts. Christina Oesterheld said, well, actually, even within Urdu, even within Urdu, you have a range of registers. In fact, even within the Marsiya genre itself, you can go from quite Persianized to very homely, particularly in the more emotional moments. You would go to a more homely, or what in Hindi we would call a more tadbhav register. Meher Faruqi wrote a really interesting article on early Quran translations, two by the sons of Shah Waliullah, sort of late 18th century Delhi. And again, maybe because, or probably because they were aimed at women or those who could not read either in Arabic or Farsi, the register chosen is actually a very, what we would call a very Hindi one, or a very kind of a demotic one, a very colloquial one. Again, this is not to say that this is their language, but this is a choice. So Purushottam Agrawal, in his book on Kabir, has written very eloquently on what he calls birth determinism. The fact that when we talk about pre-modern individuals, we think that their birth determines everything. So, so and so was born, you say, a kaya, so that also must have been, whether it's caste or religion. And instead, it's important to recover and to imagine that they too exercised choices, that they too had a range. They, of course, within what we would call in literary theory, a kind of a certain horizon, a horizon of expectation. You couldn't go beyond what was possible or what was imaginable at that time, but within the horizon of what was imaginable, people had choices and had, could choose and could play. And finally, Valerie Ritter shows how, again, there's a whole range, a whole number of poets in the late 19th and early 20th century, even those who, publicly are committed to the Hindi cause, like Hariod, Ayodhanath Singh Upadhyay Hariod. They're still, their communities of taste still include Urdu poetry, Brajbhasha poetry, and rather than think of them as kind of contradictions, they're saying one thing and doing another, I think it's probably, for me, it's more productive to think of it as a tension between a language ideology that is sort of hardening and is becoming more exclusive and exclusionary, and tastes that are, more eclectic. There's this wonderful character in Rahi Masum Raza's novel Topi Shukla of Topi's grandmother, who loves Persian poetry and hates Muslims. And of course, for him, and for Topi and for the novel, this is a kind of a paradox and a contradiction. But I think it's probably not a is not so unusual in the sense that aesthetics and ideology can often be in tension with each other. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end. I don't want to keep you too long. So before the divide then showed, again, to come back to my main argument, that instead of there being one language, the same, so often in public discourse about language, we say, oh, before the Hindi-Urdu divide, the language was one. Actually, I don't think the language was one. I think there were these different ranges of literary languages, of spoken languages, and poets and writers could either play with register, shift, and they could sort of have multiple registers. Just look at Guru Nanak in the Guru Granth. Or I've worked for my book on Avad. I worked on Maluk Das in the poet from Kala near Allahabad, and he, or Paltu Das, who moved to Ayodhya. And what you find there is really a range of they could compose, in more Brajbhasha language, in more Urdu language, in sort of mixed Farsi, quasi-Persian, as I say, when where most of the words and phrases are in Persian, and you have a few Hindi words here and there. They had this range within them. Mixed language was then a particular choice and a particular experimentation often, kind of Baihatka experimentation in some case, because obviously the language of Afzal's Bikat Kahani, of some of the other Baramase who are in the Urdu Baramase who are in the voice of the Virahini. This is a Virahini who speaks both in a very demotic, Bhai Dard So Divani, and then have whole Farsi sort of speech. And it's not so much that, we can imagine her as a character who speaks both, but really a kind of play with mixing the two aesthetics and the two poetic languages. And what for me is really, really interesting about this is that although, again, without wanting to say that, everybody understood everything, and in fact, that's why for me it's important to keep cultivation separate from intelligibility. You could more or less understand Farsi, so to say, without necessarily being cultivated in it, if you heard it often enough. So and so after the divide, then my question is, what happens when we try to do literary history from this multilingual perspective? So maybe even continue to do history of Urdu or history of Hindi or history of Farsi, but knowing that there are these other languages around and in people's bodies. What happens when we follow fashions and tastes and practices instead of single languages? What happens when we think that, okay, actually, before 1750 in Lucknow, which is, of course, one of the capitals of Urdu, there wasn't really Urdu, being written there. What do people do before then? What did they like before then? And you discover that if they cultivated poetry, they would probably cultivate Farsi and Brajbhasha. That's what Raslin does in Bilgram. Whereas as Urdu becomes fashionable, Urdu poetry becomes fashionable, Brajbhasha in Lucknow becomes only a language associated with songs, for example. So what happens when we temper our focus on language ideologies with one on tastes, and explore then instead this gap, this sort of tension between ideologies and tastes? And what happens when we think of ourselves as multilingual beings, as instead of belonging to this camp or that camp? do we have to, choose a camp, or can we be both? Can we be three things? Can we shift? And finally, this is what I've tried to do in the book that I've just finished on multilingual literary history of Purab or Awadh, where I've tried to take a multilingual approach, a spatial approach. So trying to say, okay, if I'm focusing on the Qasba of Bilgram, we know more about the Persian poets there, but what can we find about the other languages there? What can we find about Brajbhasha poetry there? And there are traces, there are archives, there are sources. What would you think of Maluk Das as a Sant poet in a Qasba like Kara, surrounded by Sufi establishments? We actually find that his biographer acknowledges one of them in the Parchai about him. What happens if we think that most of the genres of early modern literature, so poetry, song, storytelling, there were sermonizing, were all orally recited. They were listened to, heard, and overheard. And this was true both of the sort of vernacular languages, the Bhaka and the Hindavi, but also of Sanskrit, of Persian. They were recited. People listen. Like in English today, people use English words and phrases even if they haven't been to English school. And I think that was true also in the early modern period. So this is what we explored with Catherine Schofield in Tellings and Texts, which you can download free online. So for me, the history of Awadh is very much a history of from a spatial approach, where space is not one thing, but it itself is a multiplicity of stories and trajectories. And if you think, how have I done it? Well, I've tried different approaches. So in one chapter, I've tried to sort of follow one genre. So like historians, follow, one commodity. So I've tried to follow one genre, a few texts from Awadhi or Hindavi into Farsi, into Urdu, and into Hindi literary history. I had a chapter on this sort of Sant orature located in the Qasbas, a chapter on poetry cultivation, so this kind of conscious cultivation of distinction and sophistication in Persian and Brajbhasha. And then as the two cities, the two capitals of Lucknow and Banaras became kind of literary centers, what kind of literary public literary culture there was, with similar kind of although with different inflections and different proportions, but with similar public literary culture of theater, songs, and print. Okay, and if you just have a sense, this is a picture from an illustration from a manuscript of one of Mir Hassan's Masnavis, Eid Ki Tehniyat, about the bazaar in Faizabad. So you can just imagine the life of literature in, and you've got storytellers, you've got singers, you've got people chatting and talking. You can certainly almost hear the cries of sellers and of storytellers. So I think it's this sort of range. Rather than one language, it's the range. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very illuminating lecture on this divide of the languages. When your span was, quite wide, starting from before the divide and coming down to what we have to do now. Any questions or comments? Has any question come up? Let me check. let me possibly frame a question first so that the others may also follow suit. And that is that, when you talk about different registers of languages, I mean, how would you define a text, for example, like Taskira Pir Hassu Teli,
Mm-hmm.
which was composed during it's a versified account during the reign of Shah Jahan, which it is written in Persian. The language ostensibly is Persian, but half of it, contains Hindavi words.
Right.
So much so that if a Persian knowing scholar wants to translate it, it would be very difficult for him to translate because there are so many Hindavi words.
Right.
And a person not knowing Persian, knowing Hindavi, would naturally be unable to decipher what is written out there. It's, in other words, a very difficult text to understand.
Right.
Now, where would you place
Right.
such texts in this divide between Hindi?
So in this range, as I said, in this range. So I think, I mean, one of the, I think one of the points on which I say we as the sort of members of this earlier project on North Indian literary history and culture, out of which those books and conferences came out, very much insisted was also to think of the so-called, high languages as themselves having a range in them, no? Because again, it's very easy to think of Farsi or Sanskrit as exclusively high languages, no? And I mean, one of my regrets was, in fact, that I really didn't find, although I asked various Sanskritists, but they're not really interested so far. I mean, I hope they will be, in what in, for example, in Italian literary history, you would call Low Latin. So Latin, very similar thing, so Latin, which is so full of, demotic words. So, I mean, in Italy, it was a clear reason because, the Catholic Church insisted on Latin being the language of the church, but of course people did not understand Latin in the Middle Ages. So, preachers had to kind of always try and make something that ostensibly was Latin into something much more demotic that people would understand. And my sense is that, I mean, I often think of Farsi in terms of English now, So I think in the same way that English now in India is, can be spoken and used at many different levels, and with many different, many different styles, greater or lesser presence of, Hindi or other, regional words and so on. I think that may have been probably, true of Farsi as well, where, you would probably be very careful about what Farsi, if you were well educated, you spoke, and certainly when you wrote, you tended to use, to say also and so, dar Hindavi goft, but, write it in Farsi, and then occasionally have texts like the one that you mentioned, where instead, you would have more demotic words in there. But I think, the more we do this kind of textual exploration with an open mind, and without, in a way, immediately started thinking, oh, Farsi means this, or Hindi means this, or Urdu belongs to that. But in fact, exactly raise it as a question. Okay, what is this text? What is the language of this text? Who is it by? Who is it for? Where does it sit? Then I think, we think much more in terms of this range rather than. So multilingual literary culture is not about parallel developments so much. It's really about opening up the range, I think.
Right. There is another thing which sometimes concerns me, and that is that when we get references that, for example, Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni being asked to translate these, Sanskrit sources. I'm not sure whether Mullah Abdul Qadir Badayuni was in fact well versed in Sanskrit or not.
Yes, yes.
He, is consulting the pandits. The pandits are coming to him, or for that matter, in the Ibadat Khana discussions, all type of, in the Indian, Jains and Brahmins and so on and so forth, carrying on discussions with the, Muslim scholars, each probably perhaps not exactly well versed in the language of the others. So, what type of, go-between would have been developing for them to easily understand each other? I asked this question because, I get a reference from the period of Shah Jahan and from the region of Bilgram, which you mentioned. For example, you said that in Bilgram before Urdu, it was Awadhi, in which, the poetry was being said.
Braj Bhasha, actually. Braj Bhasha courtly poetry.
Yeah.
Also more courtly poetry rather than. They must have, of course, also listened to Awadhi,
Now, I get, a reference that there is a nobleman passing by through Bilgram, and he is informed about a very well-known scholar who is giving a lecture in one of the madrasas out there. So this particular noble decides to go and attend the lecture of this scholar. He has heard a lot about him. He goes there, but then he notes down that I could not understand a single word, because the lecture which was being given, and he uses the term Hindui. Such examples abound.
Right.
On the one hand, you have those registers which you talked about. On the other, we have such examples where there is a difficulty in understanding each other, and they just label it as Hindui. I just don't know whether it was Awadhi or whether it was Braj, or it was what type of dialect which was being spoken about.
Yeah. Again, I think, it's nice to collect as many, examples of this, and then rather than say, oh, this must have been the language, just stop, maybe, and just pause, and just think, rather hold it as a question. No, I think what strikes me in those, from wonderful scholar Hafiz Mahmood Sharani, hats off, and but or Mother Mohan Valvia on the other side, this sort of urge to say, oh, this must have been the language, and there must have been a common language, and this must have been it. It's not so much that, as a historian you say, oh, well, we are not sure because we don't have the evidence, but it's more like, what are the consequences of having this particular, of giving in this particular urge and saying, because then this becomes a kind of a, we know that this become reiterated, and they become, common sense, and then, for example, in Hindi literary history, then, you get all this kind of surprise that, oh, how come, people like poets like Jayasi or Qutban and so on know their Puran so well. How can they be? Though Muslims, they write, or Raslin, though Muslims, he writes in very Shuddh Braj Bhasha. So because certain expectations are created about language, identity, what was spoken, what was, rather than sort of thinking that, yes, probably reality was more, variegated, as in fact it is now,
Well, although it is not covered in your topic, but how would you define Dakkani, which developed during the Mughal period?
Right. So I'm not a scholar of Dakhani, so I haven't really, I haven't really studied. I've read a little bit of it, and but from what I understand, again, it's a. So again, I don't know how much one would say, oh, this was, I mean, my caution is always to take literary texts as evidence of spoken language use, because I think, literary, I'm Italian, in Italy, if you were not from Tuscany, you did not speak Italian until the 20th century, basically, Some of our most famous poets and writers in Italian did not speak Italian. They knew how to write it, but that was not, they knew their regional language and French. That was what you knew. So again, the idea that, was it the vernacular? Was it a vernacular spoken? Was it a literary vernacular that develops? Certainly, we have a wide range of texts in it, but we also know that it wasn't the only vernacular at the Deccan courts. That there were other.
I asked this question because certain literary texts were written in this language. I would point out Karbal Katha, for example.
Right.
I think, books of.
So I think so. Again, there's been a tendency to say, oh, this is Urdu. So you construct the object Urdu, or you construct the object Hindi, and then you try to pull everything in it. I think it's pretty clear, and even in Hindi, scholars like Ramvilas Sharma and others, have tried to look for this earlier Khari Boli sort of text, while in fact the majority of any kind of religious, non-religious, devotional, katha or pad was not in Khari Boli before the 19th century. But still, ikke dukke, you do find certain texts here and there. So, I also think, for example, the language of Banarsidass Ardkatana, quite an interesting one, because again, it's not Khari Boli, it's not Braj, it's really sort of some, Koine perhaps, or sort of a, and he uses it.
Why only Banarsi Das? For example, that there are a large number of words in Zakhiratul Khawanin.
Okay,
that's a text which deals with the biography of the nobles, right. But within that, a number of verses which are in Hindavi with so-called Khari Boli and Braj and Awadhi all mixed into it, have been quoted as far as the lives of these particular nobles are concerned. Right. So it's not only Banarsi Das, but there are other texts. There's another question. I'm sorry, we are all laymen as far as you are concerned.
Yes. So, well,
I find our questions stupid, but please try to, understand our limitations. Let us go back to Amir Khusro, for example. Now, Amir Khusro, in his No Sipeher, does talk about the Hindui languages, Hindavi or Hindui, however you may pronounce it. And in that, he not only mentions, first he mentions it in plural. The way it doesn't appear to be one single language, as you rightly pointed out. But then within that, when he goes on to define what these Hindui languages are, we get the Awadhi and Braj, which are the different registers of dialects. But along with that, he also mentions Gujarati and Tamil and, for example, Telugu. These proper languages are also, all those indigenous languages, they are mentioned as Hindui, dialects as well as languages.
So, it's because it's comparatively rare and there are not that many, sort of contemporary or later discussions of language that would sort of clarify what is the semantic, background of these words. I mean, and again, other people are more able to talk about it than me. But I wonder, at his time, when in fact there isn't really, literature yet in any of these languages known by, whether these are kind of terms, name terms and names of languages that just come out of the regions that are recognized. So there is a region called Awadh, and thus there will be an Awadhi, rather than, this is the Awadhi that later on we recognize as Awadhi, or this is the Braj that later on we recognize as Braj. So I think, again, it's very interesting that he should have that, that go into that kind of statement, but I don't know if we can take it as a sort of a recognition that at that time those were recognized as, separate languages, because in fact, then for centuries, as you say, Hindui and Bhaka are used for everything. So it's not as if you have a very ingrained sense of regional language differentiation after Amir Khusro.
Well, Amir Khusro, does accept. He says that I know Hindui, and he also claims that he also used to versify in Hindui.
Well, I mean, it's very difficult for me. It's very difficult to think of anybody who would, live or was born in India at any time and not know a vernacular language, from that time onwards. Even if their whole oeuvre is in Farsi, I mean, what do you talk to with your servants, with ordinary people? You just, I think, again, we tend to sort of think of the text or the languages as kind of so bounded that, so and so is a Farsi, Farsidan, and then their whole life is in Farsi. Maybe their whole oeuvre can be in Farsi, but then, why would, and they chose not to. That's why also, cultivation, affiliation, they are important terms, because, you don't want to deny that, but you don't you also want to think that, okay, would they have not been, if they'd heard a song or a doha, would they have not understood it? Or a dialogue, or the cry of a seller, would they not have understood it?
My take from your lecture is that starting from 12th, 13th centuries and coming down to late 18th century, there were a number of dialects and languages, you can say, which were present apart from Sanskrit and Farsi and Arabic, which were developing in India through the various centuries. Where would you actually put the divide when the people speaking Hindi would now start claiming that they are speaking Hindi or Urdu?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a bit difficult to say, because of course you have also people who kept saying, but so Hindustani, I think, is one of those positions then when people would say, well, actually I'm, and it's a position then however becomes a kind of reaction to the divide, no? To not
would I be correct to say that this Hindi Urdu divide is after the partition, when we started thinking about in communal lines, or is it before?
No. It's I mean, you so my as you know, my first my PhD and my book were on the 1920s and 30s, and of course for that I also read the work 19th century. And in Hindi, it's very strong. It's very strong. The divide, the sense of of alienation, of this whole thing of the Muslim came. The Muslims came, and then our society was in danger, and you had Bhakti poetry. Hindi could not prosper. All kinds of things, and it's there in in the history books, is there in the literary histories, is there in the historical context of critical essays. So in fact, and I think, to be honest, I think in Hindi we're still a little bit stuck there, and in fact, also this is why, when the whole sort of Hindutva, rise of Hindutva in the 1980s, for me it was like so familiar. This was the language that I had been, so used to in the Hindi magazines and associations of the,
That is what I'm asking.
So my point there is that in a way they were kind of struggling against a dominant, Urdu was then the dominant public language, so they were, it is this sort of this rise of the sort of, social historians would call, this sort of Hindu, landlord and sort of middle castes and so on, bringing together, consolidating a kind of a constituency.
So it's a 19th century construct, you want to say?
Yeah, and my point, and I think there's some question in the chat as well, in the comments, I mean that even in Hindi, this is always attributed to, Fort William College, John Gilchrist, a communal divide and rule. And although I think this is, this sort of sense of, as many have pointed out, this sense of, India is a place where, religious identity is, paramount, is very much there in the colonial imagination. So, they think of languages as, in sort of communal terms. But my point is that actually, you can't just blame the British, that, if you see somebody like Madam Malviya or, the Nagari Pashani Sabha, they are really, taken on board and, very actively promoting this kind of, and elaborating this kind of view. Of course, doing excellent work otherwise, the Nagari Pashani, without the Nagari Pashani Sabha, we would not have a kind of a survey and a collection of Hindi manuscripts, for example. They did, the library, was fantastic, a lot of, scholarly work, so that's absolutely there. I don't, I certainly don't just want to rubbish, but the cultural imagination, we know, for example, that somebody like Purushottam Das Tandon and that whole generation, they knew Urdu very well. It's not as, of course, they had studied Urdu and Farsi, but, the ideology took them somewhere else. Yeah.
I think, can you see some other question or comment? Please.
So there are multiple questions. I'll put them up.
Please put them.
We have about 10 questions.
So, the Sushil Kumar colonial identity chess, I think it's true, but not, we can't just say that. I think that's to deny agency to all those activists and writers. Yeah. Well, I think Hindi as a word comes from India, doesn't it? Hind and Hindi. So it's an adjective of India. As we said, this kind of broad ranging term. So I... so I think Muhammad Aftab Alam, I think, that's a bit...
Professor Orsini, I'm going to read one question by Nanak Ganguly, where Nanak says, how do you explain Dakhani Urdu that arose through a series of complex interactions between the local Dakhani vernaculars, Marathi and Kannada, Telugu and a Persianized dialect of Old Punjabi, brought to the south by North Indian settlers in the early 1300s? I believe you've answered this.
I think the question answers it itself. This is how it comes about. So just to answer it in a slightly different way.
Now I can see. Now I can see. I'm sorry. The questions were not visible to me.
That's okay. So a very interesting, wonderful work by Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, early Urdu literary culture and history, has this question, why isn't there more Urdu in North India, early Urdu in North India? Why is it earlier in the Deccan? Or, you have this kind of ghostly Masood Salman in, Multan and Lahore, then Amir Khusro. Well, in fact, the songs attributed to Amir Khusro, it's not Khari Boli Hindi mainly, it's more like Brajbhasha type Hindi than Khari Boli. And then for centuries, nothing. Well, my answer to that is to say that, if you were a Farsidan, or if you were a Sufi and so on, and wanted to write in the vernacular, then you would write in the regional or local vernacular. Hence, you have, the Punjabi Sufis writing in, some kind of early Punjabi. You've got the Awadhi Sufis writing in Awadhi. Why would and the Dakhini Sufis, and of course with Dakhini you've got the difference that it's given sort of legitimacy and recognition as court, as administrative language, which doesn't happen in North India for much longer.
Well, there is a question by Mehru Jafar.
Right.
Question,
yeah.
How do we make sure that the range of different activities linguistically does not shrink further?
Well, I think, partly it's to continue to, cultivate this taste and be open and listen and, be interested. I think the sort of the ignorance of the privileged is often quite a what I call a language ladder, that we think of languages as a ladder, that as you go up, you give up the languages that are perceived to be, inferior, or the languages that don't get you anywhere. I think, again, for me, the emphasis on tastes is good, because it makes what we like to listen to. I mean, like to listen to Punjabi songs, why not? Or like to listen to, Bhojpuri songs, or to, there's plenty out there. It's not as if it's not there. So if only, again, it's often a question of visibility, a question of, respect, a question of acknowledgement. And, I have a friend who was a former professor of education in Delhi University. She says, she always asks the teacher's trainees, what is your language? And at first everybody says Hindi. And then when she asks again and asks again and again, it turns out that, somebody is, Chhattisgarhi, somebody is Magahi, somebody is, but people do not own those as as languages, So I think the more you can make, that's why I think it's important to open up the public discourse on language, to change it from this keme, of, languages must be enemies of each other, and you must choose, and you must drop, and you must, if we try to change the public debate, I think there's plenty out there that, helps us keep the range as open. In fact, we know that there are, technologies like YouTube, like earlier cassettes, are great technologies for giving visibility to regional or other varieties.
There is a question by Lubna Irfan. When we talk about multilingual spaces, texts and identities, how do we address the public spaces and languages of the masses? Was there any such thing?
Yeah, thank you. So, that's of course a very good question, in the sense that, we have many more written textual sources of the elites than the non-elites. So I think for me, the sort of one possible way of getting to non-elite tastes has been through, later on for the 19th century, very much through print culture, because there's a lot of non-elite print culture. I mean, that's what my Print and Pleasure was about, which in fact showed that, there's a lot of sort of very common, very, very demotic Urdu, very demotic Urdu. You've got books like, in Urdu on, street criers and songs and this and that, so all kinds of very, very demotic qisse, for example. Earlier on, for me, one way of getting at this, what would you have listened to if you were not educated, has been through the Sans, through the language of the Sans, partly because and the Bani of the Sans, partly because we know that they are seeking out and they're trying to reach, and in fact they're really, really very eclectic and very diverse. There's a passage which I really like a lot in Nirala's sketch Chaturi Chamar, when he's told that, goes back to his village near Unnao, and they tell him that Chaturi, the elderly Chamar in the village, knows Sant poetry very well. And Nirala says, people talk about Sant poetry as poetry, but surely that's not poetry. Anyway, he's convinced and goes to listen. And so for a whole night, Chaturi and his group, clearly satsang type group, perform. And for Nirala himself is a revelation, the fact that he knew all these songs and he led them. And he names particularly Paltu and Maluk and Kabir, of course, and other sons. And the fact is that he says, I can also give you the Vyakhya, actually he says, you scholars don't really understand what these poems are about. We know what they are about. So, you have somebody like Chaturi, who's obviously not educated, who has access, and not just access as, he has heard. He can sing, he understands, he can interpret the Bani of the Sans. And if you look at the Bani of the Sans, as I say, I've been interested in what I call the three-line Sant poets, the ones that, not so much the Kabir and the famous ones or Nanak or Dadu, but ones that are local to Awadh, so like Maluk in Kara or Paltu in Ayodhya. And really they can do anything. And they even have this, what I call this quasi-Persian. I mean, I could show you if you wanted some, it's there's some in the Granth, Adi Granth as well, Guru Granth. So, you're listening and you're getting, and of course, we know that those kind of songs would then be accompanied, likely by some kind of exposition and discussion, not as part of the satsang. So you're not just listening, you're really learning about each word and each phrase and what they mean.
Well, there is another question by Lubna Irfan, once again. How do we look at journeys of texts like Jayasi's Padmavat, which in modern popular cinema acquired a different identity, meaning, and context? It became a symbol of divide, something contradictory to its original Sufi ideals.
Yes, that's, of course, I think for historians is always dispiriting where something that, or scholars, when you think something that means something different is taken to, to give a particular meaning in popular culture. I mean, I think it's part of this problem, to be honest, of this sort of continuing cluster of script language identity. So you have, where it becomes, where a text like Padmavat belongs naturally to the Rajputs, rather than belonging or being able to be, as Mikhail Bakhtin would say, reaccented, accented or reaccented, given a new meaning, given a different meaning, even created, assembled by a Sufi poet who makes the Sultan the villain and the Rajput the hero, and the Rajput princess the heroine. That becomes unthinkable. So again, the fact that this text then must belong to its natural owners and its natural community, which is that. So for me, this is a kind of back projection of the current as I say, crystallization of script language community.
Right. There is a question by Dia Roy. Shagufta, can you put it up? I can't see that question here. Here. I came across pamphlets written in 1943-44 in Nastali Persianate script in Urdu-based Hindustani for distribution among Indian soldiers stationed in Germany. How can this be explained in terms of linguistic history?
Right. Well, why would you be surprised? I mean, are you being surprised that, there's all kinds of material in both Hindi and Urdu. I mean, as we know, the army was tried to go for sort of Roman script. Most Hindustani, which Hindustani often meant, because of the kind of the weight of the earlier history of vocabulary or specialized vocabulary, either legal vocabulary or military vocabulary or other vocabulary. Often we know that Hindustani was a kind of much closer to Urdu than Hindi in terms of vocabulary. But the army, as far as I know, was tended to go for Hindustani, with the sense of the broadest possible language and the common ground also possibly. So I mean, they taught Hindustani much more than Hindi to their officers and so on. But as far as I know, in fact, often they tend to go for Roman as a kind of simpler alphabet to teach neoliterate soldiers rather than. But I would not be surprised. I mean, why not? Why would they not print pamphlets in Hindustani, in Urdu?
Well, there are a number of comments by Mr. Ali Haider, but I'll just put up his question. Can you tell us about the adoption of Shahmukhi in Sikh religion? Because a lot of Sikh texts like Zafarnama are written in Shahmukhi.
So again, I think this is part of what I say, a kind of a declustering of language and script. The idea that script was really a function of your education, of who you were copying a text for, of the education, of course, of your audience, and so on. So if Farsi was the language of education and higher cultivation among, administrators and elites in Punjab, why would they not use Shahmukhi? No, I mean, so why would they not? In the same way that the Awadhi romances are written mostly in Farsi script. So you would use that available technology of script which you have learned, and you would use it for other languages. I think again, it's only in a kind of from a modern perspective that so in a way it's you could say that it's more unusual in the South Asian in the South Asian context, the Sikh insistence on Gurmukhi as so the kind of invention of Gurmukhi as a script for the scriptures. I think that must have been a really more conscious attempt to self-differentiating themselves as a group. That, of course, didn't mean that Nanak and other of the gurus and their disciples also learned Farsi, so that was also part. That's not the only language or only script that they learned. So then that you would have texts copied in Persian script. I don't see that as unusual at all, surprising at all.
Quite correct. Well, there is a question by Hina Asim. How do you look at linguistic survey of India in terms of your concept of registers of language?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so I'm as I say, I'm not really a linguist, so I'm not, you know, I've read, I mean, I've of course looked at the linguistic survey and on Grierson's other work on Hindi. I mean, interestingly, in the linguistic survey of India, as far as I know, there is no Urdu. And somewhere else, Grierson calls Urdu, what was it? Something exotic literary Urdu, something like that. So I think he's got this sense that Urdu is not, you know, is not autochthonous, is not, you know, although of course he would know what it is linguistically, but that somehow is not legitimate. Huh? I mean, the thing that I find interesting about the linguistic survey of India is and has to do with language mapping. So again, the idea, you know, I mean, amazing work, you know, incredible work, incredible scholarship, and I think it's really quite interesting that you know, the People Survey, Ganesh Devi, and so on, they still look up to it very much. You know? So for me, that's a kind of like a telltale. You know, if they rejected it, then I would be more suspicious. But if they say no, this is, you know, an amazing, because of course it surveys not just the major languages but all kinds of regional and Adivasi kind of languages. But what is interesting is it doesn't really deal with multilingualism. It's language, you know, it doesn't think that, okay, you can be a Marathi speaker and a Gujarati speaker and no Farsi and no English and listen to Braj Bhasha, you know. That sense of a multilingual person or a multilingual area is not there. So that for me is like an interesting, really interesting flaw.
Right. There is another question by Ali Heather. Can you tell us history of Urdu in Punjab? I'm asking this because modern legendary poets from Punjab like Iqbal, Faiz wrote in Urdu and not mostly in Punjabi. It was greatly embedded in its culture.
Yes. I mean, again, why would you be surprised? No? Why would you be surprised that in a region where, you know, Farsi has been there from, you know, very, you know, the earliest works in Farsi in India were written, and Urdu and Punjabi seems to have been used for, again, it's more, you know, it's a bit like so if you were brought up on Persian and then Urdu, you know, it's not that it necessarily has to be, you know, the language of your mother. Huh? That's the language of your affiliation, the language of your culture, the language of your sohbat, no, the language of your distinction. I'm sure they understood and spoke Punjabi. You know? there's no doubt about it. But they did not write in it. No, that was not the language that they cultivated. Now, Farina Mir has written a very good book on Urdu and Punjabi in Punjab, and you know, she would, you know, I would suggest you write it. I mean, she and others make the point that part of it, although of course, you know, you could say that Urdu poetic culture was already there before the annexation of Punjab. So, you know, it was already a fashion and it was already cultivated. I don't know about Punjab, but I would be surprised if it weren't cultivated there. That the British chose to, in 1830, whenever it was, that they chose the vernacular for Punjab. They chose Urdu rather than Punjabi as a kind of containment of Sikh possible rebellion. So I don't know about that, but certainly, I mean, in a way, that to me, the history of Urdu in Punjab is not necessarily that different from the history of Urdu in Awadh or Bihar or other places where it was not the local language. No.
Well, there are a number of comments which have been made. For example, as you can see there by Elizabeth McClary, uh, who in fact goes on to praise your lecture. But I would be more interested in another one by T.C.
Yeah.
Raghavan. He says that the issue from the late 19th century was of script rather than language. Uh, the Persian script, because of its association with Arabic, had a privileged position, and dislodging it required a major mobilization, which was so successful that a script movement became a language movement and then a political movement. The mobilization around Urdu bred its own movements. Some communities straddled these divides for a long time, in particular, the Kayasths of North India. How active were the Kayasths in pre-Hindi Urdu divide period? Were they seen as bridging the gap equally at ease in different registers, or were they identified with Urdu from an earlier period?
Right. Well, so to be honest, I don't think that the first script, then language, then political, I don't really agree, because the language of script, the issue of script, if you see the way, when we talk about discourse, when we see the way in which it is couched, the cultural imaginary in which it is couched, early on from the 1860s and then early 80s. So it is an Nagari movement, but it's an Nagari movement that comes with that sense of history. It comes with that sense of this is the authentic script, and this is the script and language of this community. So I don't think that I would agree with that, actually. I think script, it's called Nagari movement, but it's not, after all, it's called Nagari Pracharini Sabha, so the association for the spread and propaganda of Nagari. But it's not just Nagari. It's Nagari and Hindi, and that particular Hindi, and that particular sense of community and history. So I don't really agree with that. And to be honest, I mean, if you say, were the Kayast already a bridge, it's like you're back projecting the divide. I think, what you find is that in, say, 18th century, so again, I think if we think of, depending on what your profession and your your affiliation, your cultivation, your religious sort of leaning was, you would have a particular range of scripts and sort of poetic tastes. Just to give two examples, there's somebody, sorry, now the title of the name escapes me, Puhukar, a poet, a Brahmin poet, well, Bhat, Brahma Bhat, a poet from a small village in, he's writing in the 1610 or so on. So he says that in his family they've all been, Brahmin, they've always been Brahmin scholars. He himself wrote in Sanskrit, but all his families were Brahmin Sanskrit scholars, and he also wrote in Sanskrit. He wrote in Braj Bhasha. He writes a sort of interesting Avadhi katha that is very kind of Braj Bhasha leaning and heavy, with kind of like a Riti katha, as I've called it. He says, I did Ser in Parsi. So he had some, acquaintance with Persian poetry. So I think depending on, he says that he's somewhere in his family had been, in fact, with, at Akbar's court and so on. So I think depending on, you could be a Brahmin. After all, Chandra on whom Rajiv Kindra has written on, he was a from a Brahmin, but in a family of administrators. So depending what you were, if you were a Patwari, if you were an administrator, if you were a Munshi, then you would have to learn Farsi. And then whatever other languages you wanted to cultivate. So it's really interesting that, you have all these, Mir Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami writes, all this Tazkireh from Bilgrami. He then goes to the Deccan, and there's been a lot written on him. Now he's the only one, there are so many Tazkirehs, but he's the only one who has a separate chapter in his Sarve Azad on the Persian poets of Bilgram, who are all, in his Tazkirahs, they're all Sheikh or Sayeds. But interestingly, so for him, it's like you have a sense that, in Bilgram, Farsidan, again, or some of them, particularly those who are interested in music or in poetry, would also cultivate Brajbasha, not typically Riti Grant, really Riti Grant, Raslin and several others. Now, was it the only one? Were they the only one? Or is it just usual because he writes about them? So I think, to say, whether people who are bridging the gap is you're already putting the gap to start with. I think if you think about range, I think then it becomes, okay, given your birth, your family, take Banarsi Das. He's a Jain merchant, but he studied some accounting and some basic literacy. He then studied Asiki poetry, which to me sounds very much like either sort of Farsi or something. And he writes something that seems like a Prem Katha, so a Premakyan, which he throws away. But certainly, he uses sort of, when talking about that, he uses a lot of Persian words. And then he then does sort of more philosophical translations from Sanskrit into sort of Brajbasha. So depending on your affiliation and your profession, you would have a different range of languages and tastes.
Well, there is a question by M.A. Samar. Sumar, I think, yeah. He says this, please correct me if I am wrong, at identity conceptual level, the communal divide was always there in the subcontinent, and Hindu-Muslim religious identities were there. But it was actually political motives which catalyzed, exploit the contrasting beliefs to antagonistic level, and in this race, we still see violence cycles since centuries in the subcontinent.
Well, Mr. Samar, I think I would say your view of history is a bit, it wants to be very simple. You have one, it's like, where is the complexity in all this? No, we know that society is complex, people are complex, we want contradictory things, we like this and we like that, we believe in this but we also like that, we believe in this but then we fall in love with that, so that's been going on. So I think the idea, and I think there's a certain confusion or not confusion, a certain kind of, again, collapsing of the idea of religious identity with communal identity. I think when people say, before the modern period, identities were fuzzier, I think that can often seem it's actually quite misleading. I don't think if you were a Muslim in 14th century North India, you didn't know what being a Muslim was. Perhaps what was your idea? What was your idea of being a Muslim? What would that allow or disallow? What would that entail? Enmity? What would it entail? A sense of superiority? So, and I think that's probably also more true, but also would it entail that you thought you were Sunni or Shia? Would that be Muslim as a sort of overarching, or would it be an identity with also different, different aspects to it, in terms of, Qom, in terms of, Vatan, in terms of, again. So I think the idea that diversity has to be enmity, and identity has to be has to be divisive. I think this is very much part of a sort of the problem. What I see, the problem of the divide, of saying that, okay, if you have this identity, that has to be antagonistic to that, rather than, in fact, it can be alongside, it can be, enmeshed with. You're no less this because you also like that, So I think this idea of, oh, well, there was always, this deep divide, is certainly what was part of that discourse of mobilization from the the 19th and 20th century. Yes, but I don't think that you wouldn't explain so much of the ordinary life of literature, of people, of exchange, if you only thought that, oh, well, there was always a civil war about to start, and that sort of just didn't always happen. That's not what that's not what the sources tell us.
Well, there is a question by Muhammad Aftab Alam. He's a political scientist. Do you think that the Hindi-Urdu divide was the direct consequence of the colonial design to create the communal schism between majority Hindu community and Muslim minority to weaken the nationalist awakening as a religious divide? Could best be concretized on the basis of linguistic one. Secondly, issue of language is also woven around the control of not only a political and administrative power, but also the creation and manipulation of imagination and thought processes.
Well, I think I've a bit answered this already.
Yes.
I think I mean.
Just let me complete. I mean, the full of it was not visible there. Right. In this connection, the Hindi-Urdu divide has successfully played its historical role, as evident in the current saffron political upsurge in India. That is what he has to say.
Right. So I think partly I've answered that before, in terms of saying that whether we think of it as design, because actually, so I've been, sorry, I'll come to your question. I've been actually quite reviewing my view of John Gilchrist of William College, who's always, to whom the sort of the divide of Hindi and Urdu is always attributed. Actually, he published a lot of Urdu, literature. He's in a way, he published all the recent classics of Urdu at Fort William College as well. So, and he published, all these books in both scripts. So, he thought of, in fact, he thought of of Hindi and Hindustani, or what you call, the three registers of languages as three registers. But then he also said that the Hindi was the language of the the rural and the language of the Hindus. So you get both. So I think it's more a question of them grappling with this linguistic diversity, with their categories that they apply when they think about India, which I say are largely religious ones. So the idea that, oh, well, language too must be divided along religious lines, rather than, you could say, well, language is what people speak. I speak, and Professor Rezavi speaks English, so it's not as if language, who does the English belong to? Is it a language that we are both speaking, isn't it? No, it doesn't belong to one or to the other. then, of course, I think that the whole sort of divide, the divide and rule, we know that the British did it. But then just to say that, this is how we can explain the whole process seems to me to negate the kind of the broader social and political process of the change in imbalance of power particularly after 1857, where certainly this Hindi this Hindi elite and their clients sort of are not subordinate anymore. No, they're not subordinate to a Nawab or to a sort of a sort of a Mughal authority in name, or post-Mughal authority anymore. So they become much more like the protagonists, or feel themselves much more as protagonists. So to think in terms of, and in their case, are you saying, okay, are they manipulating? Well, I think as usual, I think they believe in it. They think that's what they believe in. That's their view of history. That's their view of culture. And I think that's what, and then as always at the level of cultural imagination or discourse, we can see a continuity, but it's often best to think of it as a redeployment, a reuse. Because if you just think of it as continuity, you don't think of who is doing it and for what purposes. So obviously, the Hindutva sort of, even the social makeup of Hindutva and the BJP is not exactly the same like that of the Hindu organizations of the 19th century. There are overlaps, but not just. And as we know, that's actually this particular view of history and this particular view, of self and other, and this strong othering is a way of consolidating. I mean, that's what my political scientist friends tell me, consolidating a much broader community who otherwise would not feel so at home in the, for example, in the strong caste, defense of caste of the of Hindutva. No, I mean, again, you have it already partly in the early 20th century. No, Nandini Gupta's really great book on the political culture of the urban poor in the early 20th century shows that, or Sandhya Freitag, the Ahir and those kind of, lower castes went for, Hindu mobilization even then, whereas the Dalits didn't, by and large. As we know, in fact, the Dalits were kind of, or many of them were actually also kind of preferred the colonial rule to what they perceive would be a sort of Hindu rule. Now, of course, things are very different. So rather than thinking it just in terms of continuity of discourse and manipulation and cultural imagination, I think it's more useful to think of it as a redeployment.
Well, I will round up the question answer show because it has been almost 2 hours. So, but just one comment and question by Dr. Zoya Zaidi. Her question was put up, flashed, but we forgot to take it up. She says, I think expression in whatever language you are comfortable with is the most charming one. It attracts and appeals to the reader and listener. Don't you think so?
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't do literature if I didn't think that. I think fasahat, it can be in any language and register. I grew up. Well, not I grew up. I went to JNU MA Hindi classes for a year, and listened to Nambar Singh, heard Ramvilas Sharma speak, and other wonderful speakers of Hindi. beauty, who could put the most complex ideas beautifully and simply, great writers. So I don't think that, again, languages are inherently lacking or have something, and I think the more we can, as I say, respect and appreciate, really like and have the taste for that, the richer our society is. My only hope in this sort of age of the rush for English is that this aesthetic sense for for Urdu, for aesthetic and affective, so emotional, for other bolis, and is what will keep the range viable and alive. So that languages again are not just thought in terms of functional and transactional and ways of becoming of mobilization. So absolutely everybody learn English, no problem, but don't give up the other languages.
तशक्कुर, शुक्रिया, मेहरबानी. This session was excellent, beautiful. At least I learned a lot. This question of language is a very important one and a very sensitive one.
Absolutely.
Today, this program on which you presented a lecture was also, published and circulated by the Frontline magazine.
Right.
And one of the ways through which the history is being, percolated down to the level of the masses. But somebody today itself wrote a comment when I shared this Frontline, article, and somebody wrote, लेकिन आपका जो प्रोग्राम है वो तो अंग्रेजी में होता है और बहुत से लोग हैं जो उससे महरूम रह जाते हैं.
खैर, वैसे मैंने कल भारतीय भाषा परिषद के अंतर्गत लगभग यही बातें हिंदी में कही. शायद वो भी उनके फेसबुक में आपको मिलेंगी, और वहां भी मैंने बहुभाषीय दृष्टिकोण और की जरूरत और हिंदी साहित्य के इतिहास को बदलने की जरूरत और इतनी सारी बातें वही हिंदी में कही. तो दिलचस्प बात यह है कि वहां दूसरी तरह की एक तरह से दूसरी तरह की प्रतिक्रियाएं होती हैं, और वहां भी एक तरह से हिंदी पे जो आग्रह है, उनको लगता है कि इस बहुभाषीय दृष्टिकोण से ऐसा ना हो कि हिंदी पे भी ठेस पहुंचे. तो मुझे लगता है कि ये बातें आप हिंदी में भी सुन सकते हैं और अंग्रेजी में.
बिल्कुल सही. और फिर मैं अपने जो सुनने वाले हैं सामीन से ये भी कहना चाहूँगा कि हम लोग इंशाल्लाह बहुत जल्द अपने प्रोग्राम्स को न हिंदी न उर्दू, हम उसे हिंदुस्तानी में ज़रूर पेश करेंगे. उसको हम सोच रहे हैं कि पहले एक जो सीरीज़ हमारी चल रही है, जो अभी शायद अप्रैल के महीने तक या मई के महीने तक ये चलेगी, इसमें ज़्यादातर हम ये कोशिश करेंगे कि अंग्रेज़ी में, क्योंकि जो आजकल लिटरताई की ज़बान है वो अंग्रेज़ी है. जैसे एक ज़माने में हिंदुस्तान में फारसी हुआ करती, चाहे वो चंद्रभान ब्राह्मण हो चाहे कोई हो, वो फारसी में, भले अब्दुल रहीम खान दूसरी भाषाओं में भी अपने पद कह दें, लेकिन फारसी गुलबदन बानो बेगम पढ़ी लिखी इसलिए कहलाती थी कि उन्होंने फारसी में अपना अकाउंट लिखा था. तो वही दौर आज का है, कम से कम हिंदुस्तान में, जहां हम अंग्रेजी में बात करते हैं. लेकिन आई प्रॉमिस दैट वेरी सून we would also be making certain presentations which are in Hindustani or Hindi, whatever you call it. And there are a certain, for example, Purushottam Agarwal is going to speak to us, and I would request him कि अंग्रेजी ना करके वो हिंदी में बोल दें. जो मुझसे कमेंट किया गया, ये दुख जाहिर किया गया कि बहुत से लोग, क्योंकि ये कहा गया कि जो आपका मकसद है, my aim or our aim, the aim of ASHA and Ganga Jamuni is that myths should be done away with, and a proper history based on sources should reach the public. It should not remain confined only to the intellectual sections of the society. So for that, it is very necessary that we should also include certain lectures which are given in a language which is understood by the Hindi-speaking areas, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar. When we were starting with these series, we did think about this, what to do. Should we have it in non-English Hindustani language, or should we continue with English? Then, if you remember, all those who have attended our initial lectures, they would be remembering that we were bilingual. For example, when there was a Pakistani scholar, तो हम लोगों ने आधी बात हिंदुस्तानी और आधी बात अंग्रेजी में की थी. But then what we realized is that the people who are listening in, they are not confined only to the Hindi belt. India is much more larger, and secondly, our lectures are not only being heard in India but outside as well. And that is why we thought that at the moment we would continue in English. Let me once again thank my guest and a friend indeed, Dr. Francesca Orsini. As I pointed out at the beginning when we started with this lecture, and when I was introducing her, I told that I interacted with her at a time when I was at SOAS. Francesca, when I had gone to SOAS, I had gone soon after a heart attack. So I was not very, very mobile during that period of time. I was very laid back, and I couldn't benefit as much as I should have done during my stay there. But thanks to your weekly seminars, I learned a lot. Folks, Francesca हर हफ्ते एक प्रोग्राम, एक सेमिनार करती थी, और जिसमें बड़े खूबसूरत लेक्चर्स हुआ करते थे. और उन लेक्चर्स के थ्रू that was one of the things which I used to look forward every week, कि कब होगा और फ्रांचेस्का का मेरे पास ईमेल आएगा कि फला तारीख फला कमरे में वो लेक्चर होने जा रहा है.
हमारे जो दोस्त हैं इमरे बांग और कोलीग इमरे बांगा ऑक्सफोर्ड से, तो वो अभी हर हफ्ते हिंदी कोविड नाम से
अच्छा
जो पन है एक वेबिनार करते हैं जिसमें अलग अलग लोग पाठ माने पुरानी हिंदी का पाठ करते हैं. और आप उसमें अच्छी माने खूबी यह है कि लोग अमेरिका से ज्वाइन कर रहे हैं, जुड़ रहे हैं, हिंदुस्तान से. और अगर आप ब्रजभाषा पढ़ना चाहें तो आप उनको जरूर ईमेल करें. इमरे बांग
मैंने उनको कांटेक्ट किया है, and he is ready to be a part of this. So we will be inviting him as well. So once again, thanks a lot. I owe you a lot once again for agreeing to come and be here in spite of the fact that you are so busy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the discussion. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, I think that we will be continuing with these, and Shagufta, please go ahead and inform the viewers about the next week.
So for Friday at 7, we have Dr. Supriya Gandhi, who will be taking up a SOAS from medieval history. Darushukur's Majmaul Bahrain. And then on Sunday 13th at 7, we have Agra, as it was Garden of Princess Jahan Ara by Ebakor. And
So both of
thank
you
you
guys
so much.
are very good scholars. Be there.
Yes, see you all at 7, and have a great Sunday night and whatever remains of it, and see you all next weekend. Good night.
Bye bye. Good night.